Welcome. Today's episode illustrates one of the few laws that can be derived from the study of history. Did you know that for a long time it was thought that history could be an exact science and that it was possible to define its laws precisely? Today we no longer believe it. History is a chaotic thing, like human life, full of unforeseen events and randomness. But by studying it, one ends up identifying something that resembles a law, and there is one that I am quite sure of. One must not invade Russia. Today's documentary is a French documentary, the first of 2 episodes, which illustrates one of the many examples of this historical law, Napoleon's campaign in Russia. To tell the truth, it is not clear why Napoleon had to invade Russia in 1812. He and the Tsar were dividing Europe. They could have easily continued like that, but instead, they did not. There is nothing to suggest that there is some kind of historical law here, which I would formulate like this. 2 empires can never coexist. Sooner or later, one tries to devour the other. Note that I'm talking about empires, not kingdoms. These are 2 very different things. A kingdom is a national state, while an empire seeks to dominate the world, like the prototype of all empires, the Roman Empire. Certainly a lot has happened between Rome and Napoleon. However, be careful, because Napoleon still considered himself, so to speak, the successor of the emperors of the Holy Roman Empire. Just think of the title he devised for his son, the King of Rome. Only at the other end of Europe was there another emperor who considered himself the successor of the Roman emperors, the Tsar. After Constantinople, the second Rome, had fallen into the hands of the Turks, Moscow was proclaimed the third Rome. And as Ivan the Terrible said, 2 Romes have fallen, but the third Moscow stands, and there will be no fourth. Only that instead Napoleon wanted to make the 4th Rome in Paris. Not for nothing did he bring the Pope to Paris for his coronation in Notre Dame. It couldn't be clearer than that. And so these 2 Romes had to eventually clash at some point. Tolstoy was right, as he insists in War and Peace that Napoleon believed he was in command, but in reality, he was not in control. He was being driven by forces much greater than himself. Enjoy the viewing.
Peace reigns in most of Europe, but in France, disturbing military preparations are taking place. Thousands of soldiers are recruited, and the army corps are reconstituted. Yet Emperor Napoleonic proclaims that he does not want a new war. In 1811, Napoleon dominates Europe from the Mediterranean to the Niemen River. To oppose the English, he relies on the support of the Russians. After the victory over Tsar Alexander I at Friedland in 1807, and after the Treaty of Tilsit, France and Russia are officially allies, but Alexander reproaches Napoleon for his expansionist policy. Despite the agreements, the Tsar allows British commercial ships access to his ports. For Napoleon, Russia behaves like an enemy of France. Armand de Caulaincourt was the ambassador of France to St. Petersburg for 4 years and knows Russia well.
You have been told that you are greatly missed in St. Petersburg and that a banquet has been organized in your honor. Have you become Russian, Caulaincourt?
Yes, I have been asking to go back to Paris.
2 years, yes. During which I hope you have taken the opportunity to get to know your friend Alexander better. So, why does he refuse to close the doors to the English?
One cannot define a statement.
4 years ago when we signed the peace at Tilsit, he told me,
I hate the English as much as you do.
and I replied to him, then peace is made.
But he did not keep his word. It was you who invaded Germany. You support the Poles. You amass troops at the borders during peace.
In the past, Caulaincourt was his field assistant. He was able to gain his trust and goodwill. But despite his admiration for Napoleon, he does not let himself be deceived. He has understood the sovereign's game and fears for France.
Nothing can justify such a distant campaign. There have already been too many deaths in battle. Ah, Caulaincourt, you understand nothing about affairs. Russia is enormous. The climate is hostile. They will let you advance, exhausting you with forced marches. They will refuse battle. They will wait for winter.
Do you no longer trust me? Caulaincourt, do not worry. Consider the war with Russia as a matter of common sense.
The war. The word has been spoken. In the following months, Napoleon will continue to gather his armies from all over Europe, along the borders of the Russian Empire. As far as he is concerned, Tsar Alexander knows that the clash is inevitable. He hesitates for a long time between two strategies: to meet the French, or to draw them towards Moscow, to avoid French spies. This plan must remain secret from most of the general staff and the Russian people. Napoleon continues to ignore the appeals to Provence. As he notes to Caulaincourt, he is once again being dragged along by the inescapable fate to which he cannot oppose. First day of the campaign, about 500,000 men. In the ranks, they speak French, but also Italian, German, Polish, Portuguese, and Spanish. It is the army of 20 nations. The First Empire marching towards its destiny. Napoleon wants a lightning war, a demonstration of strength that, in his opinion, will be enough to bring the Tsar back to reason. He wants to realize his dream of making all the peoples of Europe one single people. They have been promised that they will return home soon. But beyond the Niemen River, which marks the border of Poland with the Russian Empire, lies the unknown.
First of all, it must be said that the Grande Armée is enormous. It is the largest army ever seen in the history of Europe.
The peculiarity of Napoleon's Grande Armée is that it includes a very high number of civilians.
Certain officers or even non-commissioned officers bring along their wives, sometimes children, and lovers, which is why sometimes that army has a somewhat heterogeneous appearance.
Some follow Napoleon from the campaign in Egypt. They are the grognards, the soldiers of the Emperor's Old Guard, the backbone of the Grande Armée. They follow this man whom they consider a genius.
Napoleon is astonished and worried about not encountering any resistance during the crossing of the Niemen, wondering where the Russian army is. However, in a letter to his wife, the Empress, he reveals nothing.
Dear friend, nothing important has happened.
I am fine, but the heat is excessive. It is England that prevents Napoleon from establishing French supremacy in Europe. Therefore, it wants to bring it to its knees and force it to peace. In 1807, an alliance was created with Russia. But it is an alliance between the strong and the weak that forces Russia to declare war on England and to cease all trade with the English. The Russians cannot comply with this part of the agreement because trade with England is vital for their economy. To their economy and filter Lemont, even more.
Then there is another element, even more ideological, namely that by bringing the war to Russia, European civilization opposes Asian barbarism.
Which Russia is complex.
The opinion of the Russians was that Napoleon wanted to conquer Russia. Napoleon wants to win the war quickly.
He plans to defeat the Russian army within 2 months and force Alexander to sign the peace on his terms. But he does not want to destroy the Russian Empire, and does not want to depose Alexander from the throne. He wants a limited war.
For Alexander III, the enemy to be defeated is Napoleon, not France, whose culture and history he deeply admires, to the point that he loves to express himself in French as well as in Russian.
Sire, this morning the Grand Army has crossed the Niemen. Without a declaration of war, impossible. 2 days ago, the new ambassador of France sent a note announcing that his mission was over.
2 key days ago. Why was I not informed?
Well, we didn't think that...
That was their declaration of war. We are ready to fight, sire. I do not agree, General. Bonaparte aims for a short war, the outcome of which will be determined by one of those victories that have brought him glory. He desires a new Austerlitz. Why not deprive him of this pleasure? Refusing confrontation is an undignified attitude. Let it be lost, and let us take our time. Alexander I is a complicated man.
In a certain sense, he is a tenacious politician, but at the same time, he is a very sensitive person, who does not have feelings of inferiority towards Napoleon in this era. Alexander I took command of the armies during the campaign of 1805, which ended in disaster, the Battle of Austerlitz. Therefore he knows that he does not have great military skills, and for the first time in Russian history, in 1812, he accepts not to personally take on the role of commander-in-chief of his army.
Thus, the defeat in 1805 at Austerlitz had taught Alexander then something. Napoleon had skillfully led him to believe that he had only 40,000 men, while in reality there were double that number. Trapped, deceived, humiliated, the Tsar and his Austrian ally had left $16,000 dead on the battlefield. It was the first of a long series of triumphs for the Grand Army, until its entry into Russia 7 years later. To put pressure on Alexander I, French spies circulate posters. To disorient the inhabitants of the Russian villages,
if he is not a lawyer, then through his actions and influence, there will be a newfound sense of freedom and an opportunity for a better, more fulfilling life. This transformation will be marked by the removal of barriers that once hindered progress and the establishment of a society where justice and equality prevail. The impact of his contributions will resonate far and wide, bringing about positive change and inspiring others to strive for a brighter future.
30 million peasants, known as mugiks, live like slaves. The slightest divergence from the orders of the nobility is cruelly repressed. They surely dream of freedom. By promising to abolish serfdom, Napoleon could win their support. But despite their suffering, they are attached to the Russian land and their world. They know nothing of the French who are approaching. At the beginning of the campaign, therefore, for Napoleon as well as for Alexander I, it is still impossible to predict how the peasants will behave. Russia is just an immense uncertainty.
There had not been an invasion on Russian territory for 3 centuries, so the Russian people perceived Napoleon's intrusion as an invasion comparable to that of the Tartars and the Mongols of the past, which their ancestors had endured.
Panfil Nazarov is only 20 years old, but the Tsar needs soldiers to fight Napoleon, who is presented as the Antichrist. And Panfil, young and single, is appointed by the community. Young mujiks like him are enlisted in the army with the agreement of their owners, who contribute in this way to the defense of Holy Mother Russia.
May God be with you, Pamphile. I will pray for you every day.
These young men, enlisted for a period of 25 years, will ultimately be considered free men, provided they manage to survive. Pamphile will undergo the difficult apprenticeship of soldier life and will soon be ready to face the Grande Armée.
At the moment they were enlisted in the army, the Mujiki were practically certain they would never see their families again. The life of a soldier was very hard.
The regiment becomes their family and is a singular form of revolution. It is a fundamental element that also explains the courage with which they fight for the regiment. It is a substitute for family.
Of the family. It is true that the Russian nobles were terrified that Napoleon would promise to abolish serfdom in Russia and that this would cause chaos.
The Great Army advances towards Vilnius, but the enemy is elusive and refuses to engage. Napoleon's Imperial Guard spots a Russian column. Confrontation, first hand-to-hand. On both sides, the soldiers are ready to die rather than give up an inch of land. A cruel taste of the upcoming battles. The French easily repel the attackers, which maintains the illusion. The capitulation of the Tsar is only a matter of days. Sergeant Adrien François Bourgogne, a grenadier of the Imperial Guard, has participated in all of Napoleon's campaigns up to 1812. For him, after all, this long march is just another campaign.
Sergeant!
Duval, my friend. No.
How you have grown.
And that wound?
A scratch. I came to offer you your share. A small trunk, taken from a Russian general and everything it contained. We have deposited everything in the carriage of Florence, our sutler. She has been following us from Spain, and I took her under my protection. But I am a man of honor, do not listen to the gossip. But, of course.
You must eat, Nigno, to resist against the Russians. Otherwise, I will tell the Emperor.
By a touching coincidence in the same regiment, Bourgogne finds 12 men from Condé-sur-Lescaut, his hometown, 2,000 kilometers away.
And him? What is he? He did not withstand the test of fire. At the first cannon shot, he left his line and returned to the rear of the battle.
The General's red wine is not to be refused. You will see and get used to it. You learn to manage fear, anguish, and pain.
And are you afraid?
Like the others. I have already been wounded twice. And I understand what it means to have to leave family because of a draft. The forced marches, the sleepless nights waiting for battle.
My family is poor, without possessions or land, or I would have had someone take my place. That is why he is here. A conscript paid someone to take his place. I haven't seen a penny yet. And look at these souls. They were supposed to last 3 years. What are we doing here? Do you know? Who are we fighting for?
Sergeant Adrien François Bourgogne has chosen to pursue a career in the army. For him, Napoleon is infallible. Come, soldier. Surely you cannot imagine that soon 11 of the friends you have just found will be dead. The Grand Army is preparing to enter Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania. Vilnius was part of the Kingdom of Poland before being annexed by Russia. But the Tsar has abandoned the city. This is a great satisfaction for the inhabitants of Vilnius and the 30,000 Polish soldiers enlisted in the Grand Army.
When the French enter Vilnius for the first time, the Poles, particularly the Polish nobility, welcome them as liberators because they believe that Napoleon will grant them freedom, indeed, that he will revive the Polish state.
Alexander was here a few hours ago. Why does he surrender the city without fighting? I warned you, sire. He will do everything to deprive you of a great battle. Time is his ally. Coward.
It brings dishonor in the eyes of the brave Poles, sire. General Balatyov, ambassador of His Imperial Majesty. No one has penetrated your lands since Peter the Great, General.
And you let me conquer a province without fighting. Aren't you ashamed, General? I assure you, sire, that the Russians will fight like lions. The Emperor demands the withdrawal of your troops. Alexander is a novice in the art of warfare. Why does he decide to take supreme command on his own? It might surprise you. Within 2 months, he will be forced to ask me for peace. We will stay here for a few days to stock up on supplies, create hospitals to care for the sick and wounded, and restructure the Lithuanian administration, because by relying on the local elite, we need to form a provisional government and proclaim its autonomy. But sire, it remains evident that our protection will be imposed upon them. Colin, I am not asking for your opinion. Do you want to declare your support for the independence of Lithuania? To say that Poland exists? We must not jeopardize our alliance with Austria. The Poles will have to be patient. Thus your appeals to their patriotism will fall on deaf ears.
Part of Poland still belongs to Austria, and Napoleon needs his Austrian allies to defeat Russia.
The Russians do not flee spontaneously in front of the French. This is a strategy decided by the high commands even before the French entered Russia.
The retreat of the Russian army must evidently be accompanied by all parties, and all means that led to slowing down the advance of Napoleon's army. Among all these means, there is obviously the policy of so-called scorched earth, which consists of destroying all available food supplies, as well as fodder for animals and all livestock.
In pursuit of the elusive Russian army, the Grand Army leaves Vilnius, marching at forced marches of 20 to 40 kilometers a day, ever farther, ever eastward. Due to the torrential rains, one must twist at every step to avoid leaving their boots in the mud. Since the Russians have burned mills and warehouses, there is no fodder for the cavalry. They are tearing rotten straw from the roofs of houses, but it is lethal for the horses. Lack of bread, dysentery, wounded that cannot be treated. Soon there will be several thousand raiders and deserters.
Already in the first weeks of the campaign, the initial dysfunctions are evident. I wouldn't call it a famine because that would be excessive. But there are nonetheless problems with food supply.
The young are feeding. It is indisputable. Several tens of thousands of men start stealing food, living off the army without being operational on the military front.
To restore order and cohesion in his army, Napoleon needs the great battle more than ever, which he has been eagerly awaiting for weeks. In the distance, many bright dots. The camps of the Russian army, the army of the Tsar. It is the long-awaited moment. They are right there, so close, in front of his eyes. Napoleon is about to achieve the objective. The great battle will take place tomorrow. A victory worthy of Austerlitz, and this war will be over. Sergeant Burgundy and his men prepare for the clash, cleaning their weapons, checking their rifles. He asks you to do it if he will. They cut the linen to bandage the wounds, because on the battlefield one must take care of oneself. Someone writes his will, his last wishes, even though he dreams of seeing his wife and children again. Others, seemingly carefree, sing or sleep. This campaign has already cost Napoleon in terms of men, horses and materials, the equivalent of 2 lost battles. Victory is necessary, and soon.
Sire, come and see. I arrive with the choir. Good morning, gentlemen.
Napoleon realizes that he has been deceived. There will be no battle. The Russians have vanished without a trace. Therefore, we must continue marching tirelessly on the road to Smolensk. The Russian summer is scorching. We are starting to run out of drinking water. Certain battalions can quench their thirst only with beer. But they resist. They move forward.
Despite all the initial difficulties of the campaign, Napoleon still has a strategy. He is here to wage war. And he is succeeding, as through the movements of his troops, he forces the Russian armies to gather around the city of Smolensk.
It is 6 in the morning, the first cannon shots. Napoleon expects to face the army of the Tsar, but there are only 20,000 enemy soldiers. They have received the order to defend Smolensk at all costs. Behind the fortifications, the city is made of wood and catches fire. Men, women and children die burned alive or asphyxiated. The city is lost. Napoleon has won. But by hindering him, the defenders of Smolensk have allowed the main part of the Russian army to escape towards Moscow. Someone will compare the tragedy of Smolensk to that of Pompeii.
An eruption of Vesuvius. Beautiful sight, isn't it, Mr. Great Squire?
Horrible, sire.
Oh, remember these words. The body of a dead enemy always has a good smell. Roman proverb.
Allow me to withdraw.
It is the Russians who keep the fire alive while their army vanishes. It would be an act of honor for your friend Alexander to measure himself against me at least once. After that, we will easily make peace like 2 champions reconciling after a duel. War is just politics, Caulaincourt.
There can be no peace as long as we are on this side of the Rhine.
Caulaincourt, you seem saddened by the harm I am causing to your friend.
The Tsar is not my friend. I am more French than others who only seek to flatter you.
Calm down, you are addressing the Emperor.
Why should I remain silent? It is an honor to have tried to prevent this war. Sire, assign me a command in Spain. Let me go.
He is too sensitive, Caulaincourt. You know that we esteem you. If Alexander speaks out against England, it will all be over.
And in the meantime...
If he does not want me to be crowned emperor at Cremolino, he will have to try to stop me.
Caulaincourt will write that Napoleon believed in a battle because he desired it and would win it. He was convinced that Alexander would soon ask for peace. His intoxication continued, and I understood that I could no longer rely on the good inspirations that had once made me so happy.
Smolensk, a city described as magnificent at the time, will be completely destroyed by a fire set by the Russians to follow the scorched earth policy.
At Smolensk, a turning point happens, the first turning point of the war, where many civilians become victims of war.
It is believed that the patriotic war against the French occupier began precisely with the conquest of Smolensk.
Napoleon, the invader. He appoints a municipal council in Smolensk made up of Russian citizens, forced to obey by the terror of reprisals and paid in French currency. He orders them to impose a contribution on the population in the form of grain, livestock and fodder. These heavy levies exacerbate the hatred against the French occupier. Yet the Russians do not understand why Alexander yields so easily without resisting their cities and their countryside.
All of this leads to a profound initial crisis of confidence between the Tsar and the population, but also to a crisis of confidence within the imperial army itself.
Letter from Russian General Bagration to his friend Yermolov. I am ashamed to wear this uniform. It kills me. They moved us around like pawns, and then we were left there with our mouths agape, bored out of our minds along the border. I dislike it so much that it drives me crazy. I want to exchange my uniform for a peasant blouse. By constantly retreating, the Russian soldiers feel as if they are behaving like cowards. Morale is at an all-time low.
Your army is said to have about 1,000 German officers. These foreigners who order the infamous retreat of your troops no longer inspire confidence.
This is why I called you. I need to appoint a generalissimo who knows how to unite the army and the people around him. The outcome of the war will depend on this appointment. I propose General Kutuzov.
Kutuzov was not at all appreciated by Alexander IV. First of all, because Kutuzov's very face reminded him of the humiliation of Austerlitz. At the time, Kutuzov had expressed a different opinion, which unfortunately Tsar Alexander did not follow.
According to sources, General Kutuzov enjoys eating a lot, and he also likes women. The accusations from generals directed at Alexander I report that in his apartment, as during the campaigns, there are girls dressed as Cossacks tasked with warming his bed, like before.
Alexander IV is decidedly puritanical, and from this perspective there is an incompatibility, we could say, of style between the two men.
To lead a liberation war, a patriotic war, a Russian is needed.
Then General Termosov will be perfect.
Kutuzov, sire, he is the oldest. Our best generals, Bagration and Benningsen, will agree to obey his orders.
The defeated of Austerlitz.
He enjoys great popularity in public opinion. He has been unanimously elected as the head of the militias of St. Petersburg and Moscow. His fame and his actions in war speak for him, and he no longer needs to prove his courage.
General Barclay de Tolly will retain command of the 1st Imperial Army, and the esteemed General Bagration will command the 2nd Army. But Kutuzov will be the new, respected generalissimo.
A good part of them despises me. After Austerlitz, they consider me a terrible general. That's fine. However, it is his troops that are demoralized and undisciplined, not mine. Let's take advantage of it. All right, let's go. March.
As soon as he was appointed, Kutuzov praises the patriotism of his troops, comrades. He writes to them, "Do your duty. Think of the sacrifices of your cities abandoned to the flames and your children who implore your protection. Think of your Emperor Alexander, who considers you the nerve of his strength. While the Tsar's army decisively reorganizes, Napoleon demands that his men exceed their limits. Rest is unworthy of his soldiers. Gusts of strong wind raise whirlwinds of burning dust. It is a true torment. The speed of the marches causes many horses to be lost. And while typhus rages, Russian propaganda targets the most vulnerable. French soldiers force you to march against us, telling you that you fight for peace. You must not believe these treacherous words. You fight for the insatiable ambition of a master who does not want peace at all and mocks the blood of the brave. Return home. You still have time. Calls for desertion, guerrilla warfare. The goal is to make the Grande Armée fragile, in order to attack it more easily. In 2 months, it has been reduced to loss. Because in addition to the sick, the dead, the wounded, and the deserters, it was necessary to leave units to hold Vilnius and Smolensk. Yet, nothing stops their advance. Cavalry and infantry are always on the move day and night to reach the invisible enemy. This war seems more absurd every day to Caulaincourt, who exclaims, "We are destroying each other with the only result of gaining ground." But by gaining ground, Moscow is only 3 days' march away. Kutuzov is under pressure and with his back against the wall. He will attempt to block Napoleon at Borodino, 125 kilometers from the sacred city. The uneven terrain, marked by ravines and covered with trees, will slow down the enemy's advance. Kutuzov establishes his line of defense on the southern bank of the Kolocha River, blocking the road to Moscow. 4 redoubts are erected, the first and largest being the Rajeski redoubt. Then there are the 2 more modest redoubts of Bagration, and the last one, the Shevardino redoubt, positioned as a frontal buffer. A redoubt is an earthen fortification built on a height, where cannons are arranged in battery. At the bottom, it is defended by a trench full of soldiers. Behind, the Russian troops are concentrated.
Kutuzov has positioned his forces here in defense. He believes he is sheltered behind the river, protected by his fortifications. At first, we will take the redoubt of Shevardino and the village of Borodino. Then we can deploy our troops for the final clash. Our armies to the north will intervene to prevent the Russian armies from surrounding us. That's all here, gentlemen.
Napoleon has 140,000, men against Kutuzov's 110,000. The French have 214 infantry battalions, 317 cavalry squadrons, and 587 pieces of artillery. The sound of the cannon, a great joy for the French and a strange relief because this time they are sure that the Russians have not left. The 2 armies are fighting at 2 particularly strategic points, the village of Borodino, which lies on the road to Moscow, and the Shevardino redoubt, an essential element of the Russian defense line. In less than 2 hours, more than $10,000 men are counted as wounded or killed. A bloody prelude to the main battle, this attack allows the Grande Armée to measure itself against the resistance of the Russians. Even the wounded, instead of asking for help, refuse to surrender and seem determined to die on the spot. But their courage is not enough. The French conquer the redoubt of Shevardino. Despite heavy losses, the first phase of Napoleon's plan is a success. Each army tends to its own wounds. The Russian side reinforces its defensive lines, especially the Rajeski and Bagration redoubts. Kutuzov organizes a solemn procession with the Virgin of Smolensk. Like his companions, Panfil Nazarov implores divine protection. While thinking of his loved ones, of what could not be said because one must be ready to die for God, the Tsar, and Holy Russia.
My sovereign music animates, as I say, for Vincenzo.
But the Russians prayed with a fervor equal to that of today, writes the poet Glinka. In these hours our hearts and souls converse in secret with the divinity.
There is no more, there is no more, there is no more, there is no more.
While the enemy relies on God, the Grande Armée, which has never lost faith in Napoleon, awaits the next day with impatience. The Emperor slept poorly. He went to bed at 3 in the morning, worried that the Russians would vanish again. But as he steps out of the tent, he regains his confidence. The first light of dawn reminds him of the sun at Austerlitz. The night before, he redefined the battle plan. He wants to strike the southern flank of the enemy forces, attack the dangerous fortifications erected by the Russians, particularly the large redoubt of Raevsky. The Imperial Guard will remain on standby, ready to intervene if necessary.
Soldiers, here is the battle you have long desired. Now victory depends on you. We need it. It will bring you abundance, comfortable barracks, and a swift return home. Behave as you did at Austerlitz, and may future generations proudly cite your conduct. Let it be said of you, he was there.
For 10 hours, the armies fight on equal ground. Fear is forgotten under a deluge of bullets, cannon fire, and grenades, and one barely notices the comrades who fall, struck down. At point-blank range, the Russians will call it the Battle of Borodino, while the French will speak of Moscow. Positions are conquered, lost, regained, and lost again. Now the 2nd Cavalry Corps of General Montbrun must charge to the right of the Rajersky Redoubt. Montbrun seeks the ideal position to attack, sets off on horseback for reconnaissance, but unfortunately a cannon shot pierces his chest. Napoleon decides to place Auguste de Caulaincourt in his position, the brother of Armand de Caulaincourt. The Russian infantry, destabilized by the mortal wound of General Bagration, recovers and doubles its efforts to regain the lost ground. The actors of this carnage speak of a hell, of a sky that burns, of the apocalypse, of cannons that spew death. Caulaincourt has a terrible premonition. At 3 p.m., his brother Auguste, leading the armored regiment, supported by 2 divisions and 2 battalions of infantry, assaults the large Rajersky Redoubt. The Russians must retreat. The wounded plead to be killed to end their terrible pain. The Russians have abandoned their positions, but their army has not been destroyed. The battle was terrifying, hellish, but for there to be a winner, there must be a loser.
I think it is very difficult to evaluate the outcome of the Battle of Borodino because both Napoleon and Kutuzov set objectives, and neither of them achieved them. Napoleon's objective was to completely defeat the Russian army, while Kutuzov's objective was to block the French and protect Moscow.
What does it mean to win a battle in that era? The army that remains in control of the battlefield is considered the winner. There are no doubts about the Battle of Moscow, as the Russians are retreating and the French army remains in control of the ground. Thus Napoleon won the Battle of Moscow. However, it is also true that, from a strategic standpoint, the Battle of Moscow contributes to an additional weakening of the Grande Armée. This is why the Russians claim it as a victory. One could agree by saying that the French emerged victorious in the Battle of Moscow and that the Russians did not lose the Battle of Borodino.
A disappointing victory for Napoleon with a significant loss of human lives, but the Imperial Guard and the elite of the Grand Army remained on the sidelines. Sergeant Burgoyne had experienced the battle from a distance, unlike many of his compatriots who found themselves on the front lines. Cautious, perhaps too much, Napoleon did not want to take the risk of weakening his guard. Yet, if he had thrown Burgoyne and his men into the fray, the victory could have been more decisive. Lives could have been saved. Perhaps Sergeant Burgoyne's comrades would have returned home safe and sound. So many heroes, soldiers, officers, generals. Caulaincourt will never forget this fateful day. "We will triumph, or I will be killed," he had confided in Auguste, brave and impetuous, before leading the victorious assault against the great stronghold. For Napoleon, France had lost one of its best officers. Caulaincourt lost his brother, his best friend. He was 35 years old. At the end of this terrible day, 120,000 cannon shots and 300,000 cartridges were fired, with a horrifying toll. On the Russian side, there were 45,000 dead, wounded, or missing, more than a third of the enlisted personnel. Napoleon lost 28,000 men. The carnage reveals the limits of rescue services. Many wounded remain on the battlefield without anyone to help them. In the Grand Army, there is only one doctor and one pharmacist for every 600 soldiers. 45 surgeons treat the thousands of casualties from both sides indiscriminately. A leg is amputated in less than 4 minutes. 10,000 wounded individuals who cannot be treated will be placed in the surrounding villages, where most will die. Napoleon intends to resume hostilities the following day, but Kutuzov will decide differently.
Why did Kutuzov not continue the battle the next day as he had promised? At the end of the clash, he had given the order to attack the French troops the very next day. But later, during the night, he issued the opposite order: retreat. The most likely scenario is that in the meantime he received information about the losses of the Russian army, and those losses were terrifying.
In the presence of his generals, Kutuzov weighed the pros and cons of a new battle for a long time, ultimately admitting that his troops are unable to stop Napoleon, and that it is therefore wise to preserve them and give them time to recover. "420,000 soldiers had crossed the Niemen 3 months earlier, but only half remain. They came from France, Spain, or Italy. They had traveled more than 4,000 kilometers, crossed the Alps, the Pyrenees, and traversed Germany, Poland, and Western Russia. They believed they could finally rest. Napoleon remains convinced that the arrival of the Grand Army at the gates of Moscow will be the final blow that will force Alexander to negotiate. From the diary of Sergeant Burgoyne: "After crossing a great forest, we finally saw Moscow. In such moments, everything is forgotten. The dangers, the fatigue, the fallen comrades. Now, only one thing matters: the pleasure of entering the promised city." But Napoleon, who dreamed of an entrance as a conqueror like in Vienna and Berlin, discovers that Moscow has been abandoned and that no notable will come to hand him the keys to the city. Only $10,000 of the 260,000 Muscovites remain, and only because they did not have the time or means to escape. Napoleon settles in the Kremlin with his guard and supply services. His generals occupy the sumptuous residences of the nobles.
What is the status of the divisions? Sire, they have broken out from the fires in every part of the city. It seems that it is the Russians who... No, I don't believe it. These barbarians are not so crazy as to destroy Moscow. There are no fire pumps. They have taken them all away. Well, find the arsonists and have them hanged on the spot.
At first, it is believed that the fires are accidental, caused by drunken soldiers celebrating their first night in Moscow. Zasipay further that this is a bit cold. But one must face the evidence. The fires are not accidental. Dozens of arsonists are scattered throughout the city. Who are they? And who gave them the order to carry out this gigantic act of destruction? Stop there. Take them.
Is anyone there? Sergeant, I think we've stumbled upon a treasure. Don't get carried away with excitement. On the ground!
Kutuzov has chosen to abandon Moscow to avoid another confrontation and to allow his army to reorganize. This is why the city's Governor-General, Count Rostovchin, left to his own devices, ordered convicts to set fire to the depots, warehouses and palaces. Nothing should be left for the invader. Are you all here? Yes, Sergeant. From the diary of Sergeant Bourgogne. At the moment of the explosion, we believed we would die buried under the rubble. The Russians had decided to use any means to destroy us.
Are you injured, Sergeant? It's nothing. Where are we?
I don't know, but this is where we need to camp.
You are not beautiful and fragrant enough to sleep in a beautiful palace. Sergeant, come and see. What shall we do, Sergeant? We take it? Attention! Everything is collapsing. We must flee. Strength!
Danger is everywhere. Napoleon's Grand Army has fallen into a trap of fire. Surrounded by flames, blinded, it continues to dream of victory nonetheless.
Welcome! Today we will see the second episode of the French documentary on Napoleon's campaign in Russia. The Emperor defeated the Russians at the Battle of Borodino, although with horrifying losses. He has occupied Moscow and now expects that the war is over and that Tsar Alexander will ask for peace. But this is no longer a war between two emperors. It is a war of the people, and the peoples do not ask for peace just because the enemy has occupied the capital. It is strange that Napoleon was under the illusion because he had experienced the same thing before. In 1805, he invaded Austria and took Vienna, but the Austrians did not surrender. It took the Battle of Austerlitz to end the war. Then in 1808, Napoleon invaded Spain, took Madrid, placed his brother Joseph on the throne of Spain, but the Spaniards continued to fight. It is strange that in Russia, Napoleon believed that the conquest of Moscow would put an end to everything, to the point that he got angry because the Tsar was not playing by the rules. Since Napoleon had been crowned and had become a sovereign, he believed he was still fighting those old, well-mannered wars of the Ancien Regime, which were a kind of duel between kings, after which they would return to being friends as before. Napoleon, who had changed the world, he did not realize that the world had changed. Enjoy the show.
Gradually, the Tsar seeks to attribute the fire to the French in order to strengthen the union with the population.
Inhabitants of the province of Moscow, the enemy of humankind, the punishment of God for our sins, the incarnation of the devil, the treacherous French have occupied Moscow, and they have laid it to waste.
The fire of Moscow was a new catalyst for the resistance of the Russian people. It was unthinkable that those invaders would take the historic capital of Holy Russia and set it on fire.
As long as Napoleon had not succeeded in destroying the Russian army, Alexander would continue to fight. There was no reason to sign a peace just because Napoleon had arrived in Moscow, and he knew that the longer he stayed in Moscow, the more difficult the position of the French would become.
Torrential rains have extinguished the fires. In the heart of this destroyed city, Napoleon cradles himself in his illusions. The Tsar will surely ask for mercy and will negotiate peace. It's only a matter of days. We must not give in now. The arsonists are arrested by the hundreds and escorted to the gallows. Forced, middle-class bourgeois, Russian policemen. Most proclaim their innocence. An order is given to kill with the bayonet anyone who attempts to flee. From the diary of Sergeant Begonia. Until Moscow, I had always been of a rather cheerful character, and above all the miseries that oppressed us. I felt that greater honors and glory should correspond to the greatest dangers and pains. The transgressions of the Grande Armée affect Sergeant Begonia.
Most of the testimonies and accounts from the soldiers who arrived in Moscow describe scenes of looting. After the fire in Moscow, Napoleon allows it to happen, permitting the city to be plundered.
And his soldiers accumulate heterogeneous objects, works of art, jewelry, and paintings. They find meat, vegetables, and drinks. Many anecdotes show that soldiers who entered the cellars of bourgeois houses get drunk and come out of the cellars unable to perform their duties as soldiers.
8th day in Moscow and no news from Alexander. However, Napoleon has found a way to contact the Tsar.
Sire, Captain Jakovlev.
Ah, Captain. I have been told that yours is one of the most respectable families in the city. That you tried to escape, but you didn't make it in time.
They have informed you well.
In exchange for a pass for you, your lover, and your son, deliver this letter to your sovereign.
I do not guarantee that he will agree to read it.
Do your best.
The Emperor hopes to push the Tsar to an honorable capitulation. The Emperor hopes to push the Tsar towards an honorable capitulation. Alexander, my brother, I love peace. It is not with pleasure that I camp here. I miss my wife and my son, and I do not wish for your unhappiness. But those who serve you pursue only personal glory. I am convinced that if no one interferes between us, our ancient friendship can soon be renewed and all our misfortunes will come to an end.
Do you think I am influenced by those around me? It is me and only me who denies him peace. Do you ignore that I ordered not to initiate, for any reason, negotiations with a good part? Your Majesty, I am just an intermediary. Take him to the Peter and Paul fortress, where he will await judgment for treason. They forced me to do it.
For Alexander Vaster, signing a peace treaty would likely be a suicidal gesture. He would be deposed from the throne and replaced.
And the Tsar understands this very well. The Tsar is categorical. Not only does he not want to negotiate, but he also does not want any discussions to take place with the French emissaries. But above all, having conquered the historical capital of Russia, Napoleon believes that the war is won and that it is now sufficient to come to an agreement for peace.
While waiting for Alexander Thurn's capitulation, Napoleon manages French politics from Moscow. He also organizes the daily lives of the soldiers to distract them and keep their morale high. He reopens the French theater in Moscow, but only the troops based in the city take advantage of it. Since Moscow has been largely destroyed by the fire, almost all the soldiers have camped on the outskirts. Outside the bastions, they are much more exposed to the enemy. They endure the attacks of the partisans, supported by armed women, determined peasants who are eager to back their fathers and husbands, and to avenge their brothers and sons.
As for the partisans, one can say only one thing. They are units of the army composed of Cossacks and Hussars. It is the greatest force that has ever fought against the French.
Coming from the southern steppes, the Cossacks formed communities of free men. Over the centuries, they were integrated into the Russian imperial armies. Having retained a certain autonomy, they do not belong to the regular troops. They are relied upon to torment the enemy, to attack the flanks, the rear guard, and the lines of communication day and night. Tens of thousands of Cossacks instill terror in their opponents, like diabolical apparitions.
Alexander continues to refuse to respond to me. What stupid stubbornness. He will regret it. I am sending you to Petersburg. You will go to Alexander and establish peace. He knows you well.
He will not receive me. He knows that time is on his side. Winter is approaching.
Enough with this winter. Here, autumn is milder than in Fontainebleau.
Do not trust, sire. The winter will come like a bomb, and in the state we are in...
Continue.
We need to re-equip our army. We need sheepskin, gloves, hats, padded boots, and the essentials for winter.
I listen to you.
Many of our men are already dead between Yemen and Moscow. And believe me, you are missing everything. No iron spikes have been prepared for the horses. What will they do with the artillery, the sick, and the wounded? The season is still good. Let's take advantage of it and leave Moscow.
Evacuating Moscow means declaring oneself defeated. I understand your scruples about meeting Alexander. Russia is devastated, so go to Kutuzov. He will not yield either. Well, I will send Horiston. He will have the honor of concluding the peace and saving the crown of your friend Khan. You can go, Caulaincourt.
The Russian capitulation is out of the question. By sending the Marquis de Lauriston to negotiate with General Kutuzov, Napoleon hopes above all to save face and preserve his army. Like Corbinocourt before him, Lauriston was the ambassador of France in St. Petersburg.
The Emperor would have liked to treat Moscow like Vienna and Berlin. But by setting it on fire, your compatriots have destroyed the work of several centuries.
Miss, do not despair. I will be with you in a few minutes.
We have never waged war in this way. Our soldiers are not arsonists.
Unfortunately, the people are convinced of the opposite. For the Russians, this war is as devastating as a Tatar invasion.
You cannot compare Napoleon to Genghis Khan.
You are right. Genghis Khan never committed the infamy of turning our churches into stables.
Your peasants show extreme cruelty towards the prisoners. They burn them, they impale them alive. Their ferocity is contrary to the rules of war.
Our regular army appears so unworthy.
No, but...
Alas, I cannot control the Mugiki. They need to be completely re-educated.
Let us at least organize some prisoner exchanges. The Emperor has a sincere desire to put an end to this dispute between two such generous nations. Therefore, let us find a compromise.
Compromise. Do you want to be cursed by posterity?
This war cannot continue.
We are trying to conclude an armistice. I have an absolute prohibition on uttering this word.
3 times Alexander will refuse to negotiate and will take advantage of it. As tired of the war on October 19th, Napoleon will be forced to leave Moscow.
Napoleon is not foolish. He is capable of calculating military risks and knows very well what will happen to him if he stays in Moscow during the winter. All his horses will inevitably die. He also thinks, perhaps with little realism, about what might be scheming in Paris since he, the Emperor, has been away from the capital for 4 months, blocked at the other end of Europe. In his last letter from the Kremlin, the Emperor announces the retreat and his decision to blow up the fortress.
But this letter reveals above all a disturbed man. He arrived in Moscow at the height of power, and he leaves more fragile. It is the beginning of an unrelenting decline. No one has ever seen him express himself with such emotion, not even in his declarations of love for the Empress or for his son. Moscow has brought him down. Napoleon's men are preparing to leave Moscow. From the diary of Sergeant Bourgogne, there was a young and graceful person among us who was said to belong to one of the prominent families of Moscow. A young woman who made the folly of falling in love with one of our senior officers, and made the even greater folly of following him in the retreat. The fatal convoy. A disordered caravan of vehicles of every kind, overflowing with the most improbable loot. Entire libraries of beautiful books, paintings by great artists rolled up to facilitate transport. Despite the premonition of the miseries to come, everyone wants to bring home their share of the trophy, like various books of sugar, rice, cookies, and liquor, in view of future deprivations. Behind the fighters, the civilians of the Grande Armée, ambulance attendants, engineers, blacksmiths, bakers, farriers, and drivers with their wives and children, they too took advantage of the occupation of Moscow. The presence of these civilians mixed with the rear guard will soon prove to be a terrible disadvantage.
Kutuzov's strategy is, in a sense, very simple. He believes that the climate will help him destroy the French army. He knows that his Cossacks, supported by light cavalry units, will force the French army to advance along the roads, thereby making food supplies impossible and condemning almost all the enemies to die of hunger.
Probably, Kutuzov's brilliant idea was to force Napoleon to retrace the path he took to reach Moscow. A few days after leaving the city, the soldiers crossed the battlefield of Borodino, which has not yet been cleared.
The battlefield of Moscow. One wonders what this victory was for, writes Sergeant Begonia. This battle is already famous for the number of casualties. As far as the eye could see, in a terrifying stench, legs, arms, and heads were emerging from the ground. The rains had uncovered the graves. What infinite sadness for all those dead who had barely retained a human form 52 days after the battle. Memories of Heinrich von Russ, a doctor in the Grande Armée. Wherever we camped or during the march, when the wounded had to get down from the vehicles or change their bandages, they were abandoned by cruel sutlers, by wealthy and arrogant women, or by merciless comrades in arms. I saw some who begged for mercy on the road. Unfortunately, as Armand de Caulaincourt had predicted, winter arrives unexpectedly at the beginning of November. The temperature drops below 20 degrees Celsius. The horses that have not been shod for the ice slip with the slightest movement and exhaust themselves. It is necessary to lighten the vehicles and carts, which forces the Grande Armée to get rid of the spoils. Moscow is now just a distant memory.
The Grand Army was not prepared for winter. Napoleon had never thought of fighting a winter campaign.
Studies have established that the combination of three factors, exhaustion, stress, and cold, disrupts the metabolism of soldiers to the extent that even if they receive 500 calories a day, their bodies only absorb a portion of it. The guerrilla tactics of the Russians, combined with the weather conditions and food rationing, accelerate the process of malnutrition and multiply the number of those who die of hunger.
Napoleon expected to defeat the Russians in 2 months. That was his strategy. But then he found himself involved in a much longer war.
The French are frozen. Starving, they tear apart the abandoned horses. They collect the blood and cook it to feed on. The Russians take advantage of the disarray to pounce on the prey. The Grande Armée is dismembered, while in Paris the throne wobbles. On October 23rd in Paris, at night, General Mallet reaches the prefecture with a few men. He captures the police minister Savary and takes him to La Force prison. Then Mallet and his accomplices go to the general staff at Place Vendôme without encountering the slightest resistance. But she has spread the word that the emperor has died under the walls of Moscow, wants to establish a provisional government, and put an end to the war. In Paris, the image of the emperor has greatly deteriorated. When Napoleon learns of the attempted coup, he has only one thing in mind.
I must return to Paris as soon as possible. I cannot allow the situation to worsen. Even though this story lasted only a few hours, there are always wise men ready to take up the enterprises of fools. You cannot return to France before the army. They were ready to ring the Saint-Roch bell to announce my death. And no one thought to appoint Maria Louisa as regent, yet I have a son, a successor. But they have forgotten him, Caulaincourt. They have forgotten the King of Rome.
While Napoleon considers returning to the battlefield, the casualties continue. By mid-November, only $42,000 men remain fit for duty out of the 104,000 who had left Moscow. The others have died of hunger, exhaustion, and disease. They have deserted, fallen behind, been captured by the Cossacks, or died in battle. Smolensk is approaching.
Napoleon hopes to move further south, into rich and untouched lands, where he can stock up on supplies. But the Russian army prevents him. forcing him to take the road back to Smolensk in haste.
They hoped to find food and fodder for the horses in Smolensk, thanks to the requisitions made on the local population by the men who remained on site. The survivors believe that their ordeal is about to end.
In Smolensk, Napoleon had given orders for supplies to be provided, so that upon arrival, the men would find something to eat. But then the troops left on site had begun to consume those reserves, which became insufficient to meet the needs of the army upon its return.
A tremendous disappointment. Starving and terribly weakened, the Grande Armée must leave Smolensk. It is a shadow of itself, and the Cossacks take advantage of its weakness to attack it from the flanks. This guerrilla warfare continues, forcing Napoleon to keep the surviving troops on a road that is already devastated. For his part, with $80,000 men, Kutuzov begins the pursuit and dangerously approaches the rear of Napoleon. He is accompanied to the north by General Wittgenstein, who, with $40,000 soldiers, is preparing to attack the center of the French army. While General Chichagov completes the Russian encirclement device, positioning his $27,000 men and 100 cannons downstream of the Beresina River. The vice is tightening, especially because Chichagov occupies a decisive position, controlling the only pasture to cross the Beresina River, the Borisov Bridge. Every day the Grande Armée weakens and suffers further losses. For those who are late and for those who remain in place, the fate is different. The wind is sharp as a razor and penetrates to the bone. The cold makes the limbs fragile as alabaster. The joints of the feet and hands break at the slightest twist, but without any pain. To more easily seize the clothes of the dead, one should not wait for the bodies to be frozen. More than one soldier finds himself naked before he has breathed his last. From the diary of Sergeant Bourgogne, exhausted from this inhuman march, I would step out of the ranks and reach some soldiers. I had one potato left to eat. Due to a selfishness that I have not forgiven myself for, I did not want to share it with my friends who were starving. But it was just ice. The teeth slid over it, unable to break off even a piece. I was overcome by a terrible desire to sleep, but I knew that dozing off would be fatal. I had to move, walk, stay awake. And I set off again. The snowstorm and the night disorient Bourgogne. The snow covers his tracks. He walks like this until dawn in search of his regiment. He no longer feels his limbs or the parasites that are devouring him. At dawn, he discovers the remains of a convoy. The hope of finding provisions? Something to endure for a few hours in this land of misfortune.
Wait, don't kill!
Diary of Sergeant Bourgogne. One must have experienced the rage of hunger to understand, if it were cooked, I would eat even the devil. Hatred is indeed joined with compassion. But the Russian soldiers are also subjected to deprivations. A prisoner is a mouth to feed. Choices must be made.
As they advance, the troops leave behind lost soldiers, stragglers, and the sick, who are immediately taken prisoner.
The fate of the prisoners varies depending on the case. Those who have the fortune of being handed over to the regular army are escorted east to prevent them from returning to fight. Then there are those who have an even worse fate. The unfortunate prisoners are left stripped of everything, in the hands of the village communities that often condemn them to death.
Alexander III, shocked by these revelations, will do everything to prevent such practices, promising a reward to soldiers and peasants who deliver prisoners to a civil authority. But the French are not immune to violence against prisoners either. In Smolensk, 600 Russian prisoners deemed unfit for the march were executed. Alexander loses patience. He knows that the conclusion is near. The Beresina is a unique opportunity, and he gives his men the order to capture Napoleon.
The Beresina is a battle that will leave its mark on Napoleon's campaign. It is the name of a river that hinders the Napoleonic army. Kutuzov decides that the Beresina will be the obstacle that will allow him to encircle Napoleon and defeat him. The army coming from Moscow approaches the Beresina and hopes to cross the river at a point called Borisov, where there is a bridge.
By Napoleon's order, Marshal Oudinot attacks the city of Borisov, which he conquers without difficulty. But the Russians have set fire to the bridge. Oudinot discovers a bridge engulfed in flames and partially destroyed. The only access point that would allow the Grande Armée to cross the Beresina is unusable. Oudinot immediately orders reconnaissance missions to find another crossing. Despite the heavy snow, one of his units, led by Corbino, is fortunate. Lost on the other bank, she meets a farmer soaked up to his chest and deduces that there must be a ford nearby. The farmer points him in the direction to follow, very close to the village of Studianka, just 13 kilometers north of Borisov. But Napoleon is not the only one to measure the strategic importance of the Borisov bridge. With 30,000 men and 100 cannons, Chichakov defends the left bank. Meanwhile, with $80,000 men, Kutuzov launches an attack against the rear guard of the Napoleonic army. He also asks General Wittgenstein to complete the encirclement maneuver with $30,000 men. But Napoleon has anticipated the enemy's move.
Then, Oudinot and Mouton, you will discreetly advance your troops towards Studianka. When night falls, you will have 2 bridges constructed, one for artillery and animal-drawn vehicles, and another for infantry and cavalry. Wait, Horiston. At the same time here, downstream under the enemy's eyes, we will rebuild the bridge at Borisov. But contrary to what the Russians will think, we will not use it. And while Chichagov will concentrate the bulk of the army here, our troops will cross the river here, at Stodjank.
The seemingly desperate situation of his Grand Army has not shaken the serenity of the Emperor. Anyone else would be destroyed. But Napoleon is greater than his misfortune. Hope intoxicates him more than the worst disaster brings him down.
Napoleon has the brilliant idea of a decoy, which works very well. Once the French have recaptured Borisov, he orders the erection of many visible structures on the spot to give the Russians the impression, the feeling, that he will pass through there.
Who will pass Russia?
At night, with the utmost discretion and with the fires extinguished, he begins to order the passage of his men in the wake of Eble's bridge builders. Tasked with building the 2 bridges at the height of Studianka,
if Napoleon's army fails to cross the Beresina, it will have no choice but to surrender. The fate of France is at stake. Napoleon goes to the shore several times to observe the fires of the Russian camps. There are many. They are close together, and this reassures him. His plan is working. The Russians believe that the main passage is at Borisov. Yet Studianka is only 2 hours' march for a trained army. The risk of being caught and attacked remains real. The The right bank of the Beresina at the height of Studianka must be protected. Napoleon orders the 50 cavalrymen of General Corbino to cross the river. Additionally, each animal carries a man on its back. With makeshift rafts, 400 soldiers reach the brave knights. An incessant coming and going between the two banks. Meanwhile, the scant Russian forces of General Kornilov are being bombarded heavily by 50 cannons, commanded directly by Napoleon. The right bank is quickly liberated. 2 hours later, they begin to set up the trestles. General Hebel does not hesitate to lead by example and dives into the icy water first. Behind him, stripped down, the heroic engineers spring into action, ignoring the monstrous ice blocks of the river. Sharp as blades, they make their task particularly dangerous. Soon the water reaches them from behind, but the bridge builders continue to set up the trestles. Many lose their lives abandoned to the current. They are immediately replaced by other brave individuals. Late in the morning, the infantry bridge is finished. By 1 p.m., the first bridge is being used by the troops from Udinu. Driven by the urgency to reinforce the right bank, they quickly cross the swaying bridge. By 4 p.m., the second bridge is completed to the right of the first. In the evening, nearly $10,000 soldiers cross the river, reaching the right bank. Night falls, and it is necessary to take advantage of it. Vehicles and cannons begin to pass. The bridge vibrates and gives way 3 times under the weight of the mass. The heroic bridge builders return to the water. It is necessary to repair or replace the destroyed parts. Time is tight. In 30 degrees below zero, they repair the bridge in less than 3 hours. Napoleon and his general staff will cross to the right bank of the Beresina only later, continuing to encourage the crossing of the platoons that arrive in an unbroken flow. From the morning, Napoleon's orders are clear. Only troops in order and armed are allowed to pass. The others, opportunists, laggards, civilians, are harshly repelled. After several days of solitary walking, Sergeant Bourgogne finally finds some companions. He joins the civilians and latecomers who have been waiting since the previous evening to cross the bridge. As a witness writes, "Those who entered Russia to fight against barbarism and introduce civilization are now nothing but wrecks, pathetic ghosts." On the night of November 27th, strangely, almost no one shows up to cross the bridge. The way is clear, but Bourgogne, exhausted and feverish, falls asleep near a nice fire. At dawn, he is awakened by the cannon fire. Then he realizes that to hope to survive, he must absolutely cross the bridge. Better to be killed by cannon fire than to die of cold or hunger. At 7 in the morning, completely alone, he gets up, takes his weapons, and without saying anything to anyone, heads towards the bridge. The frozen limbs and bones as fragile as glass make it extremely difficult for him to walk. From the diary of Sergeant Bourgogne, I saw women endure all these sufferings with admirable courage. There were even some who made certain men ashamed, who could not endure adversity with courage and resignation. He crosses the Beresina on a completely deserted bridge. Having arrived on the other side of the bridge, I had a large wooden barrack to my right. It was there that the emperor had slept, and he was still inside. Bourgogne reaches the right bank and his companions, but he does not know that in 4 hours the nightmare will begin again. Sisyakov and $27,000 men charge against Oudinot's army. The ensuing clash is terrible. Oudinot must remain in control of the right bank at all costs, a vital landing point. At the same time, on the left bank, General Wittgenstein, at the head of 40,000 soldiers, attacks the 10,000 men of Marshal Victor, the rearguard remaining near Studianka. The Napoleonic army is caught in a vice. Panic reigns on the left bank. Amidst the fighting and cannon fire, thousands of latecomers and civilians who have been waiting for 2 days rush in maximum confusion onto the access ramps to the points. Terrified men, women and children die as victims of cannon fire, trampled by horses, or fall from slippery spots. Testimony of Baron de Lara, surgeon of the Grand Army. Everyone was seized by terror. The strongest trampled the weakest, who were crushed by the crowd. From every direction, only cries and laments could be heard. Some managed to cross the river by swimming, while others met the misfortune of drowning or found themselves trapped among the ice chunks. Until 11 p.m., the clashes continue with ferocity, with the sound of cannons and gunfire under a violent snowfall. At the end of an exhausting day with many casualties, the Russian armies have been repelled, and both banks of the Beresina are in Napoleon's hands.
At the Beresina, Napoleon makes the only possible decision. He wants to save his army, he wants to continue the military campaign. The latecomers did not want to cross the bridges during the night, and the Russians are arriving. The order to set the bridges on fire is being carried out.
At night, General Ebel resumes his mission, urging the survivors on the left bank to cross the last bridge.
Ebel is a truly remarkable man, devoted to his cause, very, very loyal to the Emperor. But at the same time, he is profoundly human. And when Napoleon gives him the order to burn the bridges, he knows very well what it means. It means that thousands of people will be left to the violence of the Cossacks.
The fateful order: burn the bridges. Seeing the Cossacks approaching, General Ebel carries it out with death in his heart. As soon as the first flames ignite, everyone rushes from all sides to cross. A disordered, confused crowd of 12,000 stragglers and civilians, along with about 3,000 soldiers, jostles together to survive. Seen from the powerless right bank, the left bank is a theater of horror and suffering. A general stampede of the unfortunate caught between two fires, driven by the Cossacks who spare no one. Trapped at points that yield to the flames, impossible to go forward, impossible to go back. Under the crowd, the bridge collapses. Men, women, and children die in the flames or drown in the icy water. The balance is catastrophic, and the Beresina is a missed opportunity for Kutuzov. 7,000 soldiers and 2,000 officers of Napoleon, his Imperial Guard, his marshals, and his general staff managed to escape from 3 Russian armies, which are vastly superior in numbers.
He has not lost any battles, but he has lost the campaign. More than $600,000 people. They are either prisoners or they are dead in Russia. It is the result of the campaign.
In fact, for the Russians, the Beresina is a failure because they wanted to capture Napoleon.
The Battle of Beresina is both a disaster and a victory for the French army. In many ways, it is a battle to be proud of. Thousands of Frenchmen die at the Beresina. But what really matters is that the heart of the Grand Army is saved. I am referring to the generals, the staff officers, and all the essential military personnel. So much so that in 1813 Napoleon will rebuild a new army. In this sense, it is a victory.
On December 5th, the day of the retreat, Napoleon, unable to bear being without news from the capital, decides to return to Paris. He orders Colin Cowardy to accompany him. In 10 days and 10 nights, they arrive in Germany. After crossing the Duchy of Warsaw, they make a stop in Germany, hoping to remain incognito.
As soon as I arrive in Paris, I will reassure my people and explain the reasons for our battles. Colcourt. The events have proven you right, Colcourt. But I did not conduct this campaign like a Don Quixote in search of adventures. No. The only difference between me and other sovereigns is that difficulties block them while I love to overcome them, especially when the goal is great, noble, and worthy of me and the nation. Without the harsh weather, the Russians would have begged for mercy. All our disasters depend on 8 days. 8 days too long in Moscow, but it's not over. We will recover. Don't think that. I know what you think of me, Caulaincourt, but I have no more ambitions. These are not things for my age, believe me. I aspire to rest, but I want to finish my work.
So?
Yes.
We have been here for 2 hours. Where are our horses?
They will not be long, sir.
I find it hard to believe that this post has no horses, and that I have to go fetch them from 10 leagues away.
These are hard times, sir. It is Napoleon's fault. Just this morning, thieves stole 2 horses from us. Unfortunately...
Convinced that the postmaster is deliberately delaying them, Caulaincourt fears an ambush.
I know. There are horses here. Where are you hiding them?
Sir,
And if they are not saddled in 5 minutes, I will stab you with this. So, what do you say? The horses?
I am going to see...
Three days later, Napoleon makes his entrance at the Tuileries, while the Grand Army continues to retreat through snow-covered forests, marshy areas, and icy terrain, constantly pursued and harassed by the Cossacks and the troops of Kutuzov.
The French people do not doubt Napoleon after 1812. In fact, they will not doubt him until the end, until 1814. Napoleon enjoys relative popularity, but above all, people have a lot of trust in him. He is still a man who has won all the battles he has fought in the last 12 years. And so it is thought that in Russia it was an incident due to winter, while the cause was not only winter, and that the emperor has everything under control.
However, the campaign in Russia marks the beginning of the decline of the First Empire. 2 years later, there will be a defeat at the hands of the English at Waterloo, and France will return to the borders of 1790. Instead, it is the beginning of a new era for Russia, which invites itself to the forefront of the concert of nations. This patriotic war allows Russia to create a national identity, which will be celebrated by writers and composers. Caulaincourt will write, "The habit of success had cost us dearly in Russia. We had never learned to retreat effectively. In this long defeat, the emperor had been uncertain and indecisive from the first to the last day. Fortune had smiled on him so often that he could not believe it was unfaithful. Counting the survivors of the Beresina and those stationed in Lithuania, fewer than $30,000. French had crossed the Niemen River again, $30,000 out of 500,000 men 6 months earlier. More than 200,000 soldiers of the Grand Army had died in combat from cold, hunger, or disease. More than $150,000 had been taken prisoner. The Russians had lost $300,000 men, half of whom died in battle. From the diary of Sergeant Burgonia, the Beresina was not the end of our misfortunes. Sometime later, I was taken prisoner. The Russians decided to transfer us eastward, towards Siberia. My unfortunate companions said that it was better to be a prisoner eating potatoes than to die free from hunger and cold in the icy expanses. But I observed that it would be better to escape from their clutches. Many thousands of us died before reaching Siberia. Some accepted the Tsar's offer to take Russian nationality and settled in the land they had been asked to conquer. As for me, I finally managed to escape. In the spring of 1813, I was returning to France.